Hey guys, so yes, I'm Thomas Phinney, and I'm a font geek, and I'm okay with that. I've been doing this for a while. I was at Adobe for over a decade, in the latter part of that as product manager for fonts and global typography. I did 5 years at Extensis as a product manager for web fonts and font management, and these days I'm CEO of FontLab, a little company that does, of course, font editing tools. For people who have not been doing this for at least 20 years, it might seem like variable fonts are a shiny new thing, and in some ways they are. But the roots of this technology actually go back even longer than my time in this business. And today I'm going to explain where this came from and where it's going, how it works, and what you can do with it. I'm also going to talk a little about why it failed back in the 1990s, and I'm even going to try to predict the future a little. So, let me take you back to the early 1990s. Digital fonts were still a hot new thing. Apple still had a color logo. I still had hair. You know, things were very different. Around 1990, both Apple and Adobe began working secretly at the same time on new technologies for fonts that could change, could morph, could slide in between different possibilities, axis-based fonts, both of which shipped in 1991. Apple's GX Variations fonts were part of GX Typography, which was itself a component of their really big, ambitious GX Graphics initiative, which, well, yeah, we've all forgotten about that. But the fonts, we still remember a little. Adobe's was called Multiple Master Fonts, and these both launched in '92. So what are these design axes? Design axes, essentially, is the idea you can have different font designs and interpolate or blend between them to get anything you want, not just some particular, you know, not just these particular steps, but anything along that range. Each area of variation, anything along that range, and anything that you choose in between you would call an instance. You could have predefined instances that you could name like bold and regular, but you could also get anything in between. Each one of these areas of variation is called an axis. Weight could be an axis, width, style, go from sans to serif, optical size, we'll hear more about that later. Weight and width are the most common axes, but in principle, you can do whatever you want, almost anything, within the limitations of linear interpolation. So what's exciting from design perspective is that there's not just some set of preset fonts that some type designer picked out, but that the user can pick anything in between. This range of possible variations is called a design space. It's funny, just before this talk, just as I was going through my warm-up, I realized that I made a mistake when I created this slide here, and there's like a wrong weight there. I hate that. Anyhow, so this shows a design space with two axes, weight and width. And there can be as many axes, you know, multiple axes in a design space, and they can interact, as you can see here. So, a one-axis font is pretty simple. You can visualize it kind of like a line, right? You go from one extreme to another, like light to bold. That's simple. Two-axis font is like a flat space, a plane, perhaps, maybe a square. Again, pretty easy to visualize. You start getting into trouble as you add more axes, because it starts getting harder to really think about this as a space in dimensions, right? 3 axes, okay, we can visualize 3-dimensional space, right? It could be like a cube. That's fine. Now, as soon as you get past 3 axes, this is where people's brains start exploding. Oh, because I can't even draw a hypercube very well, but just pretend that there's two cubes. Actually, the other way to do it is to think about a cube that changes over time. I like that version. So, without further ado, let me just show you something with masters and axes. So hang on a sec. And I just have to turn off my mirror. Oh, yeah. Turn on my mirroring. Yeah, that's it. And here is a sample multiple master GX variations, whatever you want to call it, typeface. It has some axes, and in this case, in our FontLab 6 app, we're visualizing this with sliders, and there are multiple axes. Contrast, for instance, weight, whether it has serifs or not. And as it gets thinner, the style of those serifs changes with the contrast. Or width. And all these things interact. And I could play with this for a while, because obviously the possibilities are nearly endless. So that gives you some idea of the range that's possible within having these multiple masters, as we used to call them. And here, this is an awesome website. If you want to play with this technology without having to accumulate a lot of fonts yourself, I strongly suggest you check out Axis Praxis. There's a dash in the middle in the URL if you can't see it in the back row. And they let you play with a variety of fonts. And they do it live on a web page, and you can even drag your own variable fonts on there if you have others. So, now just to go back to the design side for a moment, let's pull up a glyph. And I'm going to look at a couple of masters. So the idea is that there are multiple sets of outlines. And each one of these sets has to be compatible with the others. And they have to have the same points, essentially. But where those points are positioned is what creates the variability. So this point in this master is the same as that point in that master. And then the interpolation magic happens in between. And now let me go back to mirroring, or to non-mirroring, I should say. Whoop. Let's see. Aha. Okay. So where were we? So that's how the axes and the masters work. Now, back in the day, there were these two different versions of this. Adobe had their multiple master fonts, which were basically a specialized version of the PostScript Type 1 format, and they allowed axis-based designs. And very briefly, in the very first release of OpenType, this was supported within OpenType back in 1996 for a few years, and then dropped 2 years later. The short version is that, yeah, it was only around for a few years. About 30 fonts or so were released in this format, but it all went to OpenType. Apple's GX typography, later rebranded as Apple Advanced Typography, or AAT, of course, had smart font capabilities like OpenType, but also had this optional axis-based stuff. And they called that GX Variations. And that had even less traction, less adoption among the broader design community than the multiple master stuff. It was, in terms of popular use outside of Apple, it was kind of a flop, even more than MM, which was frankly also a bit of a flop. And I say this as a big fan of the tech. So the differences between the two, Apple's GX Variations was more powerful by noticeable margins, a little more flexible. It was at the time only Mac-based and only worked with TrueType outlines. And Adobe's multiple master, they had, they could deploy it on Mac and Windows, and it only worked with PostScript outlines. And so each version only worked with one kind of outlines, and it was all complicated. So multiple master sort of started phasing out in '98, and support for it was stopped in 2004. GX Variations, never widely adopted, but never actually killed. There was never a point at which Apple actually took a stake and said, "You undead monster, you must die now," and pounded it through the heart of GX Variations. So it still has kept on all this time sort of undead, not alive, not entirely dead. Now, I need to go off on a brief sideline, and I think in a couple of minutes it will become apparent why this is a relevant story. So, OpenType has been proceeding pretty well as a fairly unified specification until a few years ago. And then something interesting happened that did not work out as well as one might like. Several different vendors each thought we needed a way of doing multicolor fonts for things like emoji. And you could use them for text fonts or whatever you wanted, but really the key use case that made everybody think we've got to do this was emoji. None of the people who thought this was important enough to do thought it was quite important enough to actually cooperate with everyone else and talk it through and come up with a standard way of doing it. So what happened was we got 4 different solutions. And all 4 of these solutions are now in the current OpenType spec. And it's not a surprise that adoption of the color font stuff has not been the fastest, because there are 4 different approaches. 2 of them use bitmaps only. One of them is outlines only. One of them is super flexible, the Adobe Mozilla approach, but is more complicated. All 4 of these, by the way, are now supported in the latest versions of Windows 10, which is impressive. Yay for you, Microsoft, but God, they shouldn't have had to support 4 different things. Now, this background is not at all coincidental to what happened over the last couple of years with variable fonts. So this was obviously not a good outcome, and everybody who was involved in this kind of, sighed and wiped their brow and thought, we screwed up, honestly. So starting in January of 2016, a sort of secret cabal of font geeks and engineers was orchestrated by Microsoft from those same companies, well, not Mozilla, but the other 4 involved. So all those people, and later joined by others, they all began meeting and plotting the variable font stuff. So what else is interesting about this is, why would they all cooperate when the last time anybody tried this stuff, Adobe did one and Apple did another? Well, the world has changed a lot in 25 years. Nobody these days is going to take seriously a font format that isn't web savvy and working across all platforms. And being web savvy means you can't do anything proprietary, right? It has to work on browsers, on all platforms. And plus, the other interesting thing is people are now eager to find new routes for compressing font data, which is really, honestly, the excuse that all of us font geeks are using to get this better adopted. Not that you heard that from me. I never said that. I'll deny it except for the video. So here are a bunch of photos from TypeCon in Seattle last August. This was the next to last secret meeting before the announcement. And then in Prague at the A-Type-I conference last fall, there was the big announcement. And this kind of friendly collaboration, everybody talking, is really how everybody kind of worked together. It's just a bunch of font geeks and engineers across company boundaries. And yeah, so no more fragmentation. And that's really kind of weird. And the fact that four big companies worked on this together in the entire history of digital fonts, nothing of any importance has ever been done collaboratively by four big companies. We've never had more than two companies collaborating. Even those generally were rocky to start with. So this was pretty amazing stuff to me. I'm like, wow, I can't believe this. It was so amazing that I had a hunch. And so I had to check the weather for that day. There's a place we all know whose weather is a strong indicator of what's going on in the world. And indeed, that explained it. So now I understood what had happened. So here's a little timeline of all this for context. Going back to the 90s when GX Variations and multiple masters came out. These days, so it's been at least a decade since most vendors started making their new fonts primarily in OpenType. OpenType's now an open standard. There's this open font format, which is technically the open version of OpenType. Most aspects of OpenType development are done in public. Now, this doesn't mean backroom discussions are unimportant. You know, a lot of the work to get the variable font stuff happening, a whole lot of that was done in the back room with a handful of people, but a big handful across a bunch of companies. So, where are we now? The formal label for this technology is OpenType Font Variations, or variable fonts for short. And it's actually totally built on an updated and expanded version of Apple's GX Variations technology. Under the hood, all the key concepts are, it's 80% Apple's and then 20% extra stuff, roughly. It's totally a superset of Apple's approach. And in terms of functionality, it's a superset of Adobe's approach as well. So anything that you could have done in those technologies, you could still do here. So what does it offer? Two key things. Compression. So instead of shipping a whole bunch of separate fonts in a family, you could ship one variable font. Well, or a second one maybe for italics. And in cases where you're using a bunch of styles from a family, this can be conceivably quite a bit smaller. And people throw around numbers like 70%. That's totally arbitrary. The real answer is it depends. And it's complicated. And it depends on the particular font, how that family was built, and all sorts of other things. But in many cases, you can use it to save space. And the other thing, of course, is the design axes. That's the variable or variations part of this. So this brings back design axes. You've already seen this. There's only one really big difference here now. So the multiple master stuff was limited to a maximum of 16 axes. I'm not sure what the limit was in Apple's version, to be honest, but at this point, the limit is much larger. You can have as many axes as you want. Actually, that's not totally true. You're limited to 64K, 65,536 design axes. That's the limit. You can't do more than that. We think that will be enough, because anyone who wants to make more than 64K master designs for a typeface, they're going to be working on it, for several centuries, I think. So with that in mind, give me just a moment here, and I'm going to show you a couple more things. There we go. Oh, I'm already unmirrored. I need to mirror. And Go to my browser, pull up my list. So here's some of the stuff people are doing these days. And some of it is pretty silly, but obviously there are real use cases. One of the things I just want to show is you can get awfully extreme. So this is a very heavy face that just has a width axis, right? But the interesting thing is how far that width axis goes. It's a little excessive, but the whole point is you can, as a designer, there isn't a whole lot of limitation on how far you can take this. Now let's try jam. Boop. And the other part of this is axes don't have to be weight and width. So this is actually an update of an old GX font. And yeah, there's bang is kind of like a weight axis-ish. Crumble, as things gradually are degraded. Splatter, extra data points. Punch, as stuff gets clotted up. So it's, you know, people can do all sorts of things. Our friend from Font Bureau, David Berlow, Font Bureau and Berlow got actually commissioned by the folks at Google to do kind of just a demo of what, you know, of some of the things you could do. And so they have a contrast axis here, for instance. Separate from that, a grade axis. This was originally intended to deal with different imaging conditions, especially on paper, but can also apply to other things. They have an optical size axis, which we're not going to spend too much time on here. Serif rise. So look at the serifs as that goes down. And of course the width and weight. And I'm going to have to just make that a little smaller to fit. X height. You know, people can do whatever. And I'm going to do one or two more. Lab. David Jonathan Ross. And one of the things we're noticing, all of a sudden in the middle here, there's this jump and there's a big discontinuity. So one of the nice things about variable fonts is people can design in discontinuities. If you want a dollar symbol that goes from having 2 slashes through it to having 1 slash, and then maybe, you know, as it gets bolder, maybe even that 1 slash doesn't go all the way through anymore, it's just top and bottom, you can have those jumps. And similarly here, in a few cases, there are sudden jumps. I don't even know what scale does. Oh, okay. There we go. That's kind of crazy. And now for the craziest one, though. Decovar, Decorative Variations, is another one of David Berlow's. And it's doing some wacky stuff. And of course all these things interact, and I have no idea even honestly what all the interactions are. Woo! Oh, and terminals. Oh yeah, this is good. Hang on a sec. Let's go back off the skeletons for a sec. Warp. And you'll notice how it now has rounded terminals. Or, hey, it's routed serif bits. Rounded serifs, or pointy serifs, or anything in between. So it gets complicated, and he just keeps on going. I could be here all day just showing you all the freaking axes that David did here, but suffice it to say they're weird. I'll just as a shorthand here. We'll just whip through a few of the possibilities. And there are different axes that do all those things. It's crazy. So, let me go back to am I back? I'm back. Okay. So that just gives you some idea of the insane range of things you can do with this technology. I think it's pretty crazy. It's pretty amazing. So let's talk a bit more about what's under the hood. You've got a single file, a single font file for a family. If you have italics, you'll usually have those as a separate font, and so you'd have two for a family. And it doesn't matter how big the family is. You're doing Kepler, which currently ships as 168 separate fonts. Well, it's still two variable font family, files. What do you have to do as the designer? You have to do some base font style, which might be the regular or it could be one of the corners of the design space. That's up to you. And in terms of what gets stored in the file, the other master designs are actually just stored as deltas from the base style, from the default instance. So that's just a much more compact way of storing it. From your point of view as a designer, the fact that they're stored as deltas is probably irrelevant. You can do all sorts of refinements. I already mentioned you could switch glyphs in the design space. So you could say, oh, once the boldness gets past this point, use this other design entirely. You can also just specify warping in the design space, which I'm sure we'll talk about more later on when we have a presentation on optical size. And you can have nonlinear changes, all sorts of stuff. And the other thing is, what are end users going to see with this? What's going to happen if you're a typographer, not a type designer, and you're just trying to use a variable font? Let's say you're trying to install it on your computer. What happens? And it depends. If you take an existing operating system from today and it's a non-savvy environment, some old version of Windows, or you're trying to install the PostScript flavor of variable font on a Mac, what would you see? Well, that depends. You install a TTF variable font, it will show a single default instance. It'll show that one master design, and it'll show up, and you can select the font on the menu, but just the one style. That's it. Nothing. You can't change anything. It's just like a single font, old style. When designing the PostScript flavor of variable fonts, Adobe decided, that's not very useful and just confusing. We think it's not worth going to extra hassles to support that. Plus, we want to improve the way PostScript outlines are handled in OpenType anyway. The CFF2 table is new in this flavor of OpenType. So a new OTF that uses this, if you try and install it on an old system, you're going to get nothing. It won't even install. It won't get recognized as a valid font, most likely, unless it has two different outline tables, one for legacy purposes, just to make it show up like an old font. Now, if you have a savvy operating system and a regular app, what you're going to get are the default instances. So it'll behave like a family, right? Those named instances are going to behave like standalone fonts. So it'll work, but you won't have access to any fancy sliders. But at least it will behave, you'll have a reasonable set of common styles picked by the type designer. It'll behave like a normal font, only potentially a lot smaller than a whole set of fonts would. That's if the OS supports variable fonts and the app does nothing special. So it just ends up being more compact. Now, where it gets exciting, if you have a savvy operating system and a savvy app or a savvy browser, then you can get at those arbitrary instances. And it would presumably work like some of the things I've been showing with sliders or potentially some other interface approach. So CSS3 already can map some CSS features to variable font axes. The newest browsers are starting to do this, at least in their pre-release versions already. You can map weight to 9 possible values in 100 unit increments. You can map width, but you can't do arbitrary axes. So all this funky, wild stuff in CSS3, there's no support for that. CSS4, still in progress, is going to allow access to a full range of variable font values, support the standard axes plus arbitrary ones. So this is coming. So where is this going? Will variable fonts succeed this time? Because multiple master and GX variations really kind of flopped. So the short answer is, of course I'll probably sound like a raving optimist here, but I think the short answer is yes, they are going to work this time. Back in the early 90s, there were honestly all sorts of problems that were way more pressing than doing this kind of fanciness. Just getting language support working properly was a huge issue. I know not all of the problems of language support are fully worked out everywhere, but it's mostly solved for much of the world now. And back then, of course, GX and multiple masters were backed primarily by just one company. Variable fonts already has way more support and way more people backing it and companies and more of the universe backing it than both GX and multiple master put together had at their peak of adoption. So that's pretty exciting. We already have cross-platform implementations, and pre-release versions of all the browsers are working with this. And it's been integrated into a standard. All the stuff is published. It's not like, oh, this is secret Apple sauce that only we get to know about. All the major operating systems are involved. Microsoft, Apple, and Google are in there. All the biggest sources of the biggest apps, Adobe, Microsoft, and Apple are there. You've got most of the web browser people in there, both mobile and desktop. There's just a critical mass of support. And then there's motivation as well. All those issues I talked about that people were worrying about 20 years ago that got solved for the most part, this is now kind of top of people's list. Everybody's motivated by making font files smaller, or at least font families. Obviously, if you only had one font, making it a variable font is going to make it bigger. But if you had several fonts before, you can make a variable font and it would be smaller. And, of course, we get awesome typography capabilities. Everybody wins. Now, when I say that variable fonts are going to succeed, I do not mean that all fonts are going to be variable fonts. Not tomorrow, not even in 5 years, and probably not even in 10 or 20 years. All I mean by variable fonts are going to succeed is that they will be widely supported and generally usable, and that there will be a fairly substantial number of fonts in this format, and you can use them to solve problems or create them, and users will probably buy them. Although, of course, it's still a crapshoot, just like any other font. For those of us who design fonts, only a few sell really well. It's just the same as with movies or any other consumer thing. So, there are all sorts of resources that you can look at. There's lots of information available online. And I'll leave this up for just a sec so that you can take a picture if you want to remind yourself of what to look up. And I have a few minutes, I think, so I'd be happy to take some questions.